Okay, welcome everyone to the Sustainable Economies Law Center's Community Renewable Energy webinar. I'm glad you could join us. My name is Yasia Skandari. I'm SELC's City Policies Program Director, and I will be moderating today's conversation. Before we get started, I'll tell you a little bit about SELC, and then I'll introduce our first speaker. The Sustainable Economies Law Center charts the changing legal territory of the new economy, educating communities and individuals about the possibilities and limits of creative economic structures, and advocating for laws that clear the way for more sustainable economic development. SELC provides essential legal tools, education, research, advice, and advocacy to support this transition to localized, resilient economies. This webinar is the first in SELC's new series on topics like transportation, housing, food, and community enterprise, so stay tuned for more. Today we have with us 3 experts in different realms of community renewable energy. I'll introduce each speaker as we come to the presentation, and then I'll moderate a short Q&A session after all 3 presentations have come to a close. If you have a question for the presenters, please type it into the Questions tab on the right sidebar of your screen, and we'll try to address it in the Q&A. And now for our first speaker, we have John Farrell, who will describe the barriers to community renewable energy and the policies and strategies that can promote it. John Farrell is a senior researcher with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and directs its work on democratic energy. John has written extensively on the economic and environmental advantages of democratizing the electricity system and the policies necessary to support locally owned renewable energy development. Among his many publications is his recent piece called Energy Self-Reliant States, featured in the New York Times, which shows that most states don't need to look outside their borders to meet their electricity needs. We're very lucky to have John with us today. Let me bring him in. And welcome, John. You're live. Go ahead.
Terrific. Well, thanks again for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. Am I all right to go ahead and advance the slides? Marvelous. Give it a try, and there we go. Terrific. Well, I've titled my presentation Local Energy Rules. It also happens to overlap with a new podcast that we're doing in ILSR featuring community renewable energy projects. But basically, it's this idea that we should focus on the policies that can overcome the barriers to community-based renewable energy. So I'm going to dive right in, give kind of an overview of where we're at with community renewable energy, why it's important, and some of the major barriers that we're experiencing to developing more community-based renewables. So really, when I look at community renewable energy, I think of it as in terms of three locals. Local in terms of geography, that it's close to where people live and where people use energy, that it features local ownership, that people are able to invest their own money and have control over their energy future, and that it, of course, in order to be these 2 things, has to be at local scale, that it can't be hundreds of megawatts in size as a power plant, that it would have to be a scale that is compatible with community ownership. And unfortunately, right now, that's a fairly small fraction of our total overall renewable energy generation. There are about 67,000 megawatts of wind and solar power that have been deployed in the United States, and I used a figure of about 1% and maybe a little less is actually owned under a community ownership model, in contrast to what we've seen in some other communities and other states and other countries around the world. But that's not because community renewable energy is inherently not a good thing. For one, it actually can really enhance the political popularity of renewable energy in general. This is the results of a very interesting survey that was done a couple years ago comparing 2 German towns, each that had a nearby wind farm. And in one case, that wind farm was locally owned, and in the other case, it was not locally owned. And they surveyed residents of each of those towns and said, well, how do you feel about adding more wind power to your community? And as you can see in the results, the community that had a locally owned wind farm had a much stronger, much more positive reaction toward the idea of doing an additional wind energy project. And I think in general that we find that's true, that when people can have a stake in the renewable energy development that is in their community, can see those energy dollars cycling through their community, they're much more supportive of it. So it's it's a political advantage to have community-based renewable energy. And it's also an economic advantage. In a study done by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory looking at community-based and local ownership of renewable energy projects, they found that local ownership multiplies significantly the number of jobs that are created by renewable energy projects. And it also multiplies that total economic impact, the cycling of those energy dollars within the local community. So community renewable energy might be a small slice of the total renewable energy pie, but it's very advantageous to pursue in terms of policy. And unfortunately, there are a number of barriers, and I'm going to talk about 5 barriers I think that there are in different sectors to advancing more community-based renewable energy. And the first one is tradition. And this can really be summed up in a single slide, which is that we have sort of this transition happening right now in the utility sector, in the electricity sector, from a sort of a 20th century model of centralized power, centralized ownership and control of the electricity system, and also centralized generation and delivery of electricity to this model of clean local power. This was actually highlighted really nicely in a Green Tech Media article entitled Adapt or Die that was published a couple of weeks ago that was basically calling out utilities and saying, if you're not prepared to deal with what the grid of the 21st century is going to look like, you're not going to be around. And the problem is that most utilities still see the system and the policies in place as supporting their 20th century vision, and they haven't figured out yet how to adapt appropriately. So tradition can be a big barrier to community-based renewable energy simply because utilities aren't used to thinking in that frame. So tradition is barrier number 1. Barrier number 2 is this idea of raising capital to put money to, people bringing their money together to build something. I can't make it any more simple than on this slide. How can the folks that are standing under this very interesting solar array buy that solar array? How can they own it? And raising capital, the rules for that are governed by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and their state level equivalents. And I'm not going to go into a great level of detail about what those rules are, but I'm going to highlight essentially the 2 problems that they present. Because the rules themselves are established for very good reasons, like preventing pyramid schemes and the Bernie Madoffs of the world from making away with our money. But the compliance costs necessary to participate, to create these kinds of offerings to raise capital are often very high. You can see that in the green box here for these 5 different examples of ways to organize people to raise capital. And on the next slide here, I've made another box that highlights what the restrictions are. So you have, on the one hand, very high costs for complying with the rules for raising capital for community energy, but then you also have these restrictions on what kind of investors you can invite in. So sometimes it might be that you can only really invite wealthy people to invest in your program. In another case, it might be that the total amount that you're allowed to raise under that regulation is limited significantly, or it may be that you can only have a conversation with people you already have a relationship with and cannot advertise more broadly. So all of these things create restrictions that make raising capital difficult in our economy. I've written more about this, but don't want to go into too much detail here, and folks can certainly read more on the slides at a later time. Happy to take questions as well. So barriers 1 and 2, we've got the tradition in the utility sector, and it's focused on a more centralized system. We have the trouble with raising capital. Barrier number 3, I like to call this cash flow. And I think that this chart is sort of illustrative of the issue. I've gotten, for example, here, a commercial solar project in the state of Minnesota. And there are essentially 4 pots of money that this solar project needs to both identify and apply for and then bring in order to make that project work financially. There's a federal tax credit, there's depreciation of that under federal accelerated depreciation rules, there's a state or a utility rebate, and then there's net metering. And all 4 of those things have to come together. And I think this slide pretty much sums up what that's like, especially for a community-based project that may not have specialized lawyers or folks working on this. There's a lot of paperwork to handle in order to do this kind of project. And that's in contrast to the policies that we see in other places, whether it's Germany and their feed-in tariff, what we call sometimes in the United States a clean contract program, Gainesville, Florida, Fort Collins, Colorado is starting a program like this. It's basically ways to make it very easy for people to create renewable energy projects and to figure out what their revenue stream is going to look like. Right now, that unfortunately for cash flow in the United States is a bit of a barrier. So we've got cash flow, we've got this idea of raising capital, we've got tradition as a barrier. Barrier number 4 is sort of the way that we structure legally our community-based renewable energy entities. And so I just like to ask this as a question, which one of these makes sense in terms of being a way that you could aggregate a lot of folks in a community in a legal structure to do a community-based renewable energy project? And the answer, of course, is all of them can make sense. All of them are ways in which communities, whether it's a geographic community or a community of interest, could come together to do that. Now, on the other hand, which one works the best? Which is the one that really enables us to solve some of those other barriers to community renewable energy? And it's kind of a trick question. The real answer is none of the above. And that's because we're going to, revisiting our cash flow discussion from earlier, we've got this commercial solar project. It's got these 4 different pots of money. But now we're going to organize under one of these legal structures that would really make sense for a community-based renewable energy project. Unfortunately, it means that we often have to introduce a middleman. So if we're doing a nonprofit model or a city ownership model, we can't use the federal tax credit. We're not a taxable entity. So we have to introduce some sort of middleman, some sort of third party, and they're going to take their cut. And a lot of the evidence shows that that might be as much as half of the value of that tax credit. So there's this overhead associated with doing a community-based project that is not there for a commercial project. Or alternatively, if you don't want that middleman, you could simply give up the federal tax credit, which of course is giving up 30% of your revenue stream, for example, for a solar project. And so the legal organizations that would make the most sense for community-based renewable energy, unfortunately, don't allow us to overcome some of the other major barriers to community-based renewable energy. So let's talk about barrier number 5, the last barrier. And this is what I call the utility-based barrier. And I would encourage people not to read this entire thing. The infographic in all its glorious detail is up on our website at ilsr.org. But basically, the idea here is that utilities establish limits on the amount of distributed generation, small-scale renewable energy that can come onto their system. And the basic concept behind their limit is this safety margin. They never want more renewable energy produced in a local area than is consumed, because they don't want that power to be able to flow out onto the rest of the grid, because they designed it in a one-way direction. And there are some other issues there, but that's the basic concept. Well, the problem is that utilities don't actually measure how much we use on a certain part of the grid, especially the minimum amount, which is what matters. Because if we're talking about supplying more than there is demand, we need to know what our lowest demand is. But they think it's about 30% of the peak demand, which they do measure, because that's how they determine, hey, we need a new power plant in order to meet this peak. So they take this 30% of peak, which they think is about right, and then they divide it by 2 for a safety margin. And so you get this default cap of 15% of peak power on a local power system is what's allowed in order for local-based renewable energy development. And that would include community-based renewable energy and any other kind of small-scale renewables. Now, the good news is there are states that are solving this policy problem, like Hawaii and California. I would encourage you to read more about that on our website. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but it's something that applies in most states, and it can be particularly problematic if you, for example, have one community with very good local policy that gets a lot of people investing in renewables. They're going to hit this cap, even though the overall cap for development of small-scale renewables is nowhere near being hit. But speaking of that, this is a map right here that gives you a sense of what those overall limits are. This is the aggregate limits on total net metering. So the amount of electricity that can come from customers who are using net metering to connect to the grid, which is what most small-scale renewable energy projects use. The red states have a limit of 1% or less of the total state's electricity sales can come from net metering projects. Yellow states that they have a limit as well, but it's higher than 1%. And then the states in gray have no limit in law at all. But you can see, unfortunately, there's a fairly good overlap with a lot of the states that have, for example, a lot of solar and other small-scale renewables and having some sort of limit on the books. So those are the 5 barriers that we've got. We've got tradition, we've got raising capital, we have cash flow, we have the legal arrangement that we can use to do community renewable energy, and we have utility policies and other things. Let's talk about some of the solutions that can be done on a local level to solve some of these problems. Most people who are on this call have probably already heard of PACE, or Property Assessed Clean Energy. The basic idea is let's make it really easy to do energy efficiency and local renewable energy by having a city-run program that kind of simplifies all of the different pieces and makes action very easy, and that solves the financing misalignment. You know, Americans move on average once every 5 or 6 years. Financing a lot of these things takes a longer time period than that. What if we allow people to pay for these kinds of improvements through their property tax, pass those payments along with the benefits of whatever gets installed on the home, and all of a sudden you're talking about a real opportunity. Unfortunately, there are a lot of barriers. There's a problem at the federal level, which I will not go into too much detail, that has really strongly curtailed the residential programs, but there are some really promising examples of commercial-based PACE programs that are still in operation in Sonoma County, California, and other places. Another good local action is focusing on permitting. Both Solar and a number of others have really focused strongly on this so-called part of the so-called soft costs of solar. And what they found is that best practices in terms of making it very easy and streamlined to do local solar projects can significantly reduce the cost of doing solar. And reading this chart from left to right, as the cost of solar goes down, the potential savings from implementing good local permitting policies rises significantly as a portion of the installed cost of that solar project. I've just got about 3 more things here. Franchise negotiation. There's a campaign in Minneapolis. It's modeled on what has happened in Boulder, Colorado, which you'll hear a little bit more about later. This idea is that utilities, even in a regulated state where they have a guaranteed monopoly, often sign these 20 or 30-year franchise contracts with the cities that they serve that govern the use of public right-of-way to deliver that energy service. These contracts are up for renegotiation from time to time, as they are in Minneapolis with the incumbent gas and electric utilities in the next couple of years. It's an opportunity to jump in and to try to make changes about the energy future of that city, to put things on the table like local energy production or clean energy. There's also this policy called Municipal Aggregation. I've got an asterisk here because only the states in color on this chart are ones that have a state law that authorizes this. But it's a really exciting opportunity, sort of a municipalization light, if you will, that gives cities the chance to choose their energy supplier, to negotiate on behalf of their small customers, to get better prices, and maybe even to encourage more development of local renewable energy. It's a concept that has a lot of promise, and there are over 300 communities in Illinois that have chosen to go this way in the past year and a half. But it's definitely something that is a little shorter of some of the more significant steps like municipalization that can accomplish a lot of local energy options. I think this is my last example, but this is municipalization. Obviously, you have some examples like Gainesville, Florida, where the local policy, because you get to set that at the local level, is very strongly supportive of community-based or local solar development. You have the exciting results from Boulder in terms of their study of the potential for municipalization, that they could get lower rates, better reliability, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and reach 54% renewable energy by switching to a municipal utility from their incumbent Xcel Energy. So some real possibilities there. It's a very long and complicated process, but at the same time, it is one of the powers that reside in most communities to make a difference in their energy future. I lied. I have one more thing, and that's mandates. Lancaster, California has a great example. They just implemented a building code standard that says that every time they have a new residential development, there has to be an average of 1 kilowatt of solar on each new house. So it doesn't have to be on every house, but it has to be that average. The state of Hawaii has a solar hot water standard for every new house built. So there are opportunities in states that give locals, communities, the authority over buildings to have some of those, to make some of those differences, help overcome some of those barriers to community renewable energy. So I'm going to leave it there because we got some great other presenters that I want to get to, but you can obviously find more information on our website or on my personal blog, energyselfreliantstates.org, and thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Linda Barrera, who will describe the legal landscape for community renewable energy projects. Linda is a mechanical engineer and lawyer who currently serves as an environmental attorney with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. She previously practiced in the area of utilities regulations as an attorney for the California Public Utilities Commission. She gained interest in renewable energy through her work building solar systems in rural Nicaragua. As a volunteer for the Sustainable Economies Law Center, Linda keeps her finger on the pulse of local and community-owned solar. She also contributed to the newly published ABA book called Practicing Law in the Sharing Economy by Janelle Orsi, SELC's Executive Director. Linda, thank you so much for joining us. Let me bring you up here and make your mic live. And you should be live and
Thank you, Yassi. It's a pleasure to be participating in the webinar and to be part of such a distinguished panel. John just went through some of the financial and legal barriers to community renewable energy. I'm going to provide a quick overview of the legal landscape, but mainly focus on what options are available to overcome some of these barriers. I will first discuss ownership models and allocation of economic benefits. Next, I will just briefly discuss the types of financial incentives for community renewable energy projects. And finally, I will give an overview of existing laws and policies which can be improved upon to further incentivize locally based clean energy production. Renewable energy technology is by nature more decentralized. It will expand quicker under a completely different infrastructure and market. A true energy transition must ensure the participation of all stakeholders. New ownership models are needed to get local stakeholders directly involved in this transition. Local ownership and control helps a community create a project that meets its particular needs while addressing issues such as the type of technology to be used, the scale, the location, financing, all issues that local stakeholders are best positioned to tackle. There's no right way to structure a community-owned project. It all depends on what works for a particular community. For example, communities can choose to structure a project as a business, generally creating a limited liability company because it provides liability protection to its members, flexibility in ownership, management, and decision-making power. With an LLC, the profits pass through to the owners who pay taxes at their individual tax rates. The University Park Community Solar LLC in Maryland is one such example. Organizers hosted the project on a local church. Around 30 community members purchased membership interest to buy and install the solar panel. A third party installed and maintains these panels. The LLC passes the benefits to its members based on the revenue from the energy generated by the solar system under a long-term purchase power agreement with the host. Community members also receive benefits from a 30% federal tax credit, a state grant, and are allowed accelerated depreciation deductions on the renewable equipment. Other groups have chosen to structure as a cooperative. A cooperative is a legal entity owned and democratically controlled by its members. Cooperatives help to stabilize the local economy by ensuring that profits return to those who produce them. Acorn Renewable Energy Cooperative in the town of Middlebury, Vermont is a co-op that developed a solar photovoltaic group metering project in collaboration with two partners, the town of Middlebury, which provided the land, and the cooperative insurance company, which provided equity investment. Members of the cooperative also provided some of the funding for the project. Acorn receives 1/3 of the electricity produced from the project, which is then subdivided into separate subscriber accounts for the individual co-op members. As shown in this slide, project organizers of community-owned renewable projects can face many challenges. Most notably, it can be difficult to take advantage of tax incentives when community investors do not have significant taxable income. Another expensive hurdle is potentially having to comply with securities regulations to raise capital, as John mentioned in his presentation. In addition, organizers must determine how the project will be managed, negotiate contracts between the owners, host, and the utility, and set up processes for allocating benefits. This slide shows a sample structure of a community-owned renewable energy project. Given the complexities of forming a business and raising capital, some community groups may want to make use of an existing business entity, so to speak, like a third-party host or a developer with the legal and financial experience to develop a community solar project. An example of this is the Clean Energy Collective, an LLC business in Colorado, which was created to develop and maintain community-owned renewable projects. Less than 2 weeks ago, Clean Energy Collective announced it is developing a community-owned project in Denver in response to Colorado's Community Solar Gardens Act, which I'll discuss briefly later. Clean Energy Collective's community solar model allows Xcel Energy's customers to buy as few as one panel or as many as needed to completely power their homes or businesses. Members of the project receive a credit on their utility bill for the energy produced by the solar panels, while also obtaining a credit comparable to the rebates and tax benefits of an individually owned and home-sited solar system. For some communities wanting to organize a community renewable project, their local public utility may be a good place to start, given that they might have already the financial and management infrastructure to implement the project. This slide shows some of the disadvantages of utility-sponsored and nonprofit ownership models. With the utility-sponsor model, public utilities such as municipalities, cities, etc., cannot benefit from federal tax incentives because they're exempt from paying federal taxes. We have the same issue under a nonprofit structure since there are 501(c)(3)s. If a community is in the territory of an investor-owned utility, the challenges, as John mentioned, are different, but even greater, given that it's much more difficult to encourage investor-owned or privately held utilities to develop community renewable projects. As John discussed, many communities are pushing, or some communities are pushing their local governments to adopt a community choice aggregation program. While CCA programs are not generally designed to increase customer ownership of renewable energy projects, communities can use aggregation and local control to maximize clean and local energy development. The following slide shows a simple structure of a community-supported renewable energy project. One example of this type of project is the Ellensburg Community Renewable Energy Park. In that example, the city owns the project. Local community members partner with the city to help fund the project. Contributions made by the utility customers were used to purchase the solar modules. The city will give the contributors a $1 credit under electric bill for the value of the electricity produced by the solar system. There are several ways of allocating the economic benefits from the electricity produced by a community renewable energy project, but these benefits are highly dependent on the metering policy in place in the state, the proportion of the bill credit received, and of other state laws and regulations that may support community renewable energy. In a moment, I'll discuss some of these laws and policies, but first I'll mention several financial incentives that project organizers must consider when assessing how to structure their community project. Some of these financial incentives include, for example, the renewable energy credit, which is an environmental benefit resulting from not generating the same existing electricity and emissions from the conventional gas and coal-fired plants. These environmental benefits are generally packaged in RECs and can be sold separately from the electric power. Another incentive is the Business Energy Investment Tax Credit, which reduces the federal tax income from qualified tax-paying owners of renewable energy projects. It ranges from 30% for solar, fuel cells, and small wind turbines to 10% for geothermal, microturbines, and combined heat and power. Under the Federal Modified Accelerated Cost Recovery System, businesses, but not individuals, may recover investments through depreciation deductions of purchased equipment. You also have the Clean Renewable Energy Bonds, which is a tax credit bond. It is a federal loan program that can be used by the public sector to finance renewable energy projects. Finally, there are many state, local, and utility incentives, rebates, and loans that could assist community renewable energy projects. The eligibility and timing for these incentives are very complex. You should consult with an attorney and tax advisor to assess the options in your jurisdiction. As I mentioned earlier, community shared renewable projects can be structured to expand local ownership opportunities and monetize financial incentives by providing local participants a return on their investment in clean energy. But project organizers must recognize that an attempt to raise capital among the community may be deemed as issuing a security. If the project is offering a security, the project organizers must comply with securities law, which require registering the offering with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. Registration is a time-consuming process, so organizers of small-scale community-owned projects must seek an exemption to the federal registration requirements. It is important to seek counsel and legal advice to learn how to navigate federal and state securities regulations. But as John mentioned, upfront costs such as complying costs, even for using an exemption, could still be significant for a small-scale project. There's new legislation, the Crowdfund Act, which is part of the Jobs Act of 2012, which will allow project organizers to raise capital from the public using an SEC-registered crowdfunding intermediary. The maximum amount that can be raised is $1 million, and each investor will be able to invest up to 5% of his or her annual income or net worth. Crowdfunding could boost community-owned solar projects, especially in states with virtual net metering, because it can allow potential investors to share the electricity output. So for community renewable energy to be feasible, group net metering and virtual net metering policies are needed. Group net metering allows community members served by the same utility to combine their meters as a single billing entity. The output of the system is netted against the group bill. Virtual net metering allows net metering credits generated by a renewable energy system to offset load at multiple retail electric accounts within a utility service territory. Unlike group metering, virtual net metering credits are applied on each community member's electric bill. Feed-in tariff is a policy mechanism that can be used to encourage investment in community renewable electricity projects by guaranteeing to investors access to the grid and offering them a long-term contract to community investments. The few states that have enacted feed-in tariffs have done so in a very limited manner, which really has not promoted community renewables. A number of states have enacted Renewable Portfolio Standards, or RPS, that require utilities to purchase a certain percentage of their energy from renewable sources. 16 states plus the District of Columbia have Renewable Portfolio Standards with solar or distributed generation provisions. Of the states with distributed generation provisions, none specifically require that the distributed generation come from community-owned or community-sponsored projects. Finally, very few states have enacted policies to promote community-owned renewable energy in its purest form, and that being local community members owning at least a portion of the renewable energy project. This is an area in which I think that cities and communities can engage with their local public utilities and city councils to implement policies that encourage at least some level of local ownership, because this can help spur investment in the community, keep more dollars invested locally, create jobs, and encourage a sense of community. Colorado, Maine, and Washington are 3 states that have laws specifically encouraging community ownership of renewable energy projects. Colorado's legislation, which was enacted in 2010, allows for the development of community solar gardens using virtual net metering. Community solar gardens allow for multiple utility customers to purchase or lease interest in a single photovoltaic system and to have the electricity produced by their share of the system offset the electricity consumption of their home or business. Washington's Community Solar Enabling Act of 2009 allows for ownership of community shared solar projects up to 75 kilowatts. Participants receive production incentives based on their proportion share of the output of the project. The Ellensburg Community Renewable Energy Park in Washington, which I mentioned earlier, is one example of a project which is benefiting from Washington's law. In June 2009, Maine established a community-based renewable energy pilot program to encourage the development of locally owned renewable energy resources. Up to 50 megawatts of generating capacity will be or is permitted under the program. To be eligible for the program, a generating facility must be 51% locally owned, must use renewable energy resources. It cannot be larger than 10 megawatts in generating capacity, and it must be obviously located in the state. The other states shown on this slide are limited to virtual or group net metering programs and generally do not include other elements to support community ownership. This slide includes web links with additional information and resources. I especially encourage you to review the SIRE website, which includes state incentives for renewable and efficiencies, and also to check out SELC's book on practicing law in the sharing economy, which has a lot of good information about cooperatives. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda, for your presentation. Please enter your questions on the right column of your screen. Okay, we have a question from one of our participants, if one of you would like to address this. Can you say more about how the Crowdfund Act might help community projects get off the ground?
Sure. Well, right now, the SEC is working on the rulemaking, so we have to wait and see what they're going to put forth. It's not going to be entirely an easier process, given that the law requires an SEC-registered intermediary that needs to comply with a very long series of rules and regulations. But the idea is that community members and people from out of state will be able to donate a small amount of money, and the whole idea about crowdfunding is being able to reach a larger amount of people interested in investing in clean energy. So it's an exciting prospect. We need to see how it's going to play out. There is a group right now in the Bay Area called Solar Mosaic. Now they're Mosaic, and they actually went through the full SEC registration, but they are very popular and people are very interested in investing small amounts of money and getting a return. So it's exciting to learn that groups will be able to skip some of the expensive registration requirements and time-consuming process, and use internet-based platforms to raise a small amount of money from large amount of people to contribute and propel, so to speak, the clean energy economy, including small-scale solar and other types of systems.
Okay, we have a follow-up question from Bruce. Is the issue Go ahead, John.
I can address that. It's kind of there are a lot of different components of that. I mean, what my understanding is, and I would encourage you to check out Sunrun did a 2010 report on kind of best practices and what was out there and what needed to change. But basically, you know, a PV system is fairly simple in terms of the electrical hookup and what really needs to be done to make sure that it operates safely. But a lot of communities require like a full-scale engineering study for installation on a rooftop, or maybe have an extensive number of inspections that are required both pre and during and after the installation. So you can have a very long timeline, and then also some communities use permitting as a way to generate a little bit of revenue. And when you're talking about something as expensive as a PV system, that can be a fairly expensive permit. So there are a lot of different moving parts in that that can all make a significant difference in the cost, especially as solar gets cheaper.
Okay, thank you, John. And we still have another question here for Linda. In a co-op model, could you talk about the benefits or limitations to benefits that members can apply?
Well, one of the main benefits of a cooperative model is that members all share the benefits, the control, and ownership of the enterprise. And this is very important because the members have close association with the enterprise as consumers, producers, and as employees of the enterprise. One of the major barriers are the fact that even though you have a large pool of people or members of your cooperative, it might be difficult to take advantage of some of the federal tax incentives, given that a lot of members may not have significant taxable income, which people refer to as they don't have a large tax appetite. In addition to that, they might have to comply with Securities and Exchange Commission regulations to raise capital. So it's mainly raising capital, and second, taking advantage of tax incentives and other incentives as well.
So we have another question here from Ben, and that is, what is your response to the argument that virtual net metering creates mini utilities that don't pay for transmission and distribution?
I think that's a good question for John.
Thanks, Linda. I'll take a stab at it. What I would say, I think, about virtual net metering and other policies that encourage, on-site generation and kind of non-utility acquisition of electricity is simply that, this is the model that we're going to. It's where technology is taking us and the opportunity that's out there. And in the sense that you create small utilities that are serving what customers want, that isn't necessarily in line with the existing system. Yeah, it is. It is doing that. The question is, how do you design policy that captures that? So, you have a debate, for example, about regular old net metering, where utilities say this costs us money because it's lowering demand and they don't pay their fixed costs. And then you have independent analysis coming out and saying, well, the benefits outweigh the costs to the system because the energy that's being connected to the grid has all sorts of special value in terms of avoiding these transmission costs and reducing stress on the distribution system, et cetera. So what I would say is that right now we're sort of operating outside the policy and regulatory regime that we set up for running the utility system. And it's not in a way that's yet, I think, particularly harmful to utilities, but in the long run, we're going to need to design our policy smarter to take that into account.
Okay, thanks, John. Another question from Sharon is, can co-op members be promised any return on their investment?
It depends. It depends of how the co-op is structured. Some co-ops are structured as limited liability companies, and they are able to provide their member investors a return on their investment. Under the, as an example, the Acorn Renewable Energy Cooperative in Middlebury, Vermont, is providing their co-op members a return on their investment based on the electricity produced by their system.
And we have a question here. Do solar leasing programs help or hinder community renewable energy?
I'll take a stab at this. And thanks for the question. I think it's a really good one. To me, solar leasing is all about solving a policy problem with regard to having our incentives all be done through the tax code. That creates some of those issues I mentioned with the barriers in terms of finding the right legal structure to do community-based renewable energy. And leasing to me is all about solving that problem for individuals. So in the sense that it encourages people to do stuff individually rather than in a community orientation, I'd say it might be a problem, but I think really it's, most people either don't own their own property to put up their own renewable energy system or don't have the right rooftop for it if it's solar, for example. So solar leasing doesn't really help them because it's all about solving that problem for the individual. And I think that you're going to find probably some leasing arrangements that might even help community-based systems capture those tax incentives. So it solves a dumb problem in our policy design, and I think it's probably not terribly of big concern to community-based renewable energy, but it doesn't really hurt, nor does it help.
And we have an interesting question here about would it be possible for a big national co-op like REI to offer solar power to its members?
I'll take a stab on this question. Well, REI is a very large national organization, a co-op, but for community-based, small-scale renewable energy projects, for example, solar, you would have to, well, first of all, determine where the community is located, whether it's in a investor-owned utility or a public utility service territory. So REI seems a little bit too large of a co-op to be able to address local needs and work with local communities. They're somewhat restricted in who they can partner with to be able to develop their solar project, for example, and then sell the electricity back to its public or investor-owned utility. So it's a good idea, but it won't necessarily fit for the small-scale local renewable project base approach that we're discussing about today.
Thank you, Linda. Now we come to our final speaker, Heather Bailey, who will share a story of the opportunities, challenges, and lessons learned from the Boulder Energy Future Project. Ms. Bailey is the Executive Director of Energy Strategy and Electric Utility Development for the City of Boulder, Colorado. She was hired by the city to help manage its Energy Future Project by providing direction in the creation of both short and long-term energy strategies and leading the city's energy municipalization exploration project. With over 30 years of utility operations, finance, accounting, and auditing experience, Heather has worked as a regulator, utility executive, and consultant. Heather, thanks for joining us today. I want to make a note that Heather's joining us over the phone bridge and the volume is rather low, so I encourage all audience members to turn up the volume for the duration of Heather's presentation. And Heather, tell us what you know.
Yeah, I will zip through this very quickly, and thank you all for being so patient. We had a little technical difficulty. Boulder, as you know, has embarked on a pretty significant effort, really driven by the community and it's all shifted around the issue, it's all focused on the issue of climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. You've heard John and Linda talk about the municipalization and the solar gardens. So I'm going to kind of zip through this very quickly and hit some high points. Basically, just a little bit of history. Boulder in 2002 passed a resolution that the community had a commitment to meet the Kyoto protocols. From there, they identified programs and issues that they wanted to address. So the city agreed to tax itself, which is the first time ever a city has basically levied a carbon tax on itself. But it's really a way to find funding to support energy efficiency and demand-side management programs and provide incentives and rebates for distributed generation. And this was on top of what was being offered by the incumbent utility. As the city evaluated what needed to happen, they realized they needed a lot more than what was currently on the table. So the cap tax passed in 2006 and was just renewed last year by an 80% margin voter support. So it was really an important part of the community. What it means, as I mentioned, it provides incentives and it represents a substantial impact above and beyond what the current our path to sustainability. Basically, our current generation mix is about 15% renewables, with the majority of the generation coming from coal, hence the concern about greenhouse gas emissions. You heard John talk about the Solar Gardens legislation as well as Linda. We had a group of folks actually here in Boulder that originated the legislation that was ultimately passed. It allows people who don't have the ability to put solar panels on their homes or facilities to buy into a solar garden and get the benefits of that distributed generation, which has been very successful. We just had the celebration of the completion of our first solar garden last Friday, so it's a big deal here, and we hope to see plenty more. In fact, obviously Boulder's pushing the limit when you have the executive, the chief executive officer at SELC say that we keep pushing them to do good things. So I think that's a compliment. Two things that we're doing concurrently is in looking at what the cap tax gave us was the ability to put in the load-based program, as I mentioned. What we found in measuring the progress of those programs is that we were not going to achieve the Kyoto Protocol by 2012 as originally hoped. That the biggest impact would be addressing the supply side. So Boulder has embarked on a very ambitious plan to look at municipalizing their own utility, basically take over the investor-owned, in order to have control over the supply side of that equation. Just a little bit of history. This started in 2005 when the city began to research options for reducing greenhouse gases. In 2010, the franchise with Xcel expired and was not able to be renewed because negotiations fell apart, primarily around being able to change the resource mix. And so in 2011, the voters passed a charter amendment that said they authorized the city to go forward with exploring municipalization, but it had to meet certain requirements. So what's the disconnect? The disconnect between what the city's value, what the city residents value over Xcel is that Xcel has a coal-based portfolio and they have a limited ability to change that. They have a significant investment in coal-fired generation. The incumbent utility is regulated by the PUC, which is setting rates that benefit the overall good versus meeting local control over decision-making with respect to their electric supply was very important. And as John mentioned earlier, the business model that's currently in place that rewards the sales of kilowatt hours and the putting of iron on the ground is really outdated, and it's in conflict with the overall goals. So Boulder is looking at what is the utility of the future, and they'd like to create that, and they have a great opportunity. They've been evaluating what can Boulder do to be positioned for a low-carbon future, focusing on customer choice, moving to treating energy as a service versus a commodity, very similar to our smartphone concept. Boulder also is currently a hub of energy technology innovation, and they want to be able to support and promote that. They'd like to leverage the infrastructure to be able to test some of these technologies and ensure reliability. Lastly, they really have identified the fact that changing that business model is the only way to really move the economics forward. After our detailed analysis that we've been working on for the last year, we've come up with some very significant conclusions and we've done pretty in-depth analysis. We've modeled the load, cost, and a resource mix for the next 20 years. And what we found is that we modeled various options, and under some of those options, we can offer equal or lower rates over the next 20 years. We can actually maintain and exceed reliability. We can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by more than 50% and increase renewable resources by 50% over what currently exists. And we can provide a path for strong economic development. Now, what the models show is that that can be done by a municipal utility. However, that can also be done potentially in partnership with the existing investor owners if they so choose. Basically, our lessons learned are what I've kind of already covered, but you can't just address your load side. You've got to address supply if you're going to make a difference. Not all options are effective as far as cost. You've got to be flexible. Our ability to meet our objectives exceed our expectations. And just being aware there's always going to be naysayers, so do your homework. And sorry this is so rushed, but if you'll go to our BoulderEnergyFuture.com website, there's a whole lot of detail and information on what we're doing. And that's a great place to find more about what we're doing. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Heather, and thanks to all the presenters. I'd like to also thank our co-sponsor, the Post-Carbon Institute, and like to mention that SELC is in its last leg of our spring matching grant campaign, where every donation is doubled. So if you found this webinar helpful or would like to support SELC's work generally, please contribute on our website at theselc.org/donate. Without your support, our work would really not be possible. With that, we'll have to wrap up our webinar. Thanks for participating, and you can find a recording of the presentation on theselc.org. Thank you and have a great day.